someone who's channeled Ben Wicks and doodled all over the book.
Yes. Well, you know, it was very important to me to let the reader know that they weren't getting a book of reference. That I wasn't going to write, in a sense that I wasn't going to write the book.
It says a literary atlas of Canada right on the front of it.
That's
but
right.
You don't do that.
No, but yeah, I got to tell you, when I first sold this book to Doug Gibson and Heather McClelland and Stewart, I explained to him that this was not going to be a book of reference. This was not going to be a paean to the creek or coulee in which the writer had grown up, and it was not going to tell the reader which 5 authors to read in North Ontario or in Manitoba. That it was this other thing, this exploration, and I listed all the themes. And he said yes, 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 and I was well aware that by the end of the dinner he'd forgotten that and was still expecting the book telling the reader which 5 people to read. And so I thought, well, it's going to be necessary to let the reader know that in certain ways. And for instance, I had it in my mind to do certain illustrations of my own, and then I realized first of all, I couldn't do it, and that the person whose illustrations I had in mind was the Newfoundland novelist Michael Winter, who had once done a doodle of the menu of the dinner we were having. And so I phoned him up and asked him whether he would consider it. And that was late in the day, at which point my wife, the president of the House of the Nancy, turned to me at the breakfast table and said memorably, "If you were my author, I'd slap you around." She was so fed up with what I did.
It's almost an anti-atlas, because you actually, instead of handing someone a literary atlas of Canada, you pretty much by the end of the book, you're forced us to go, well, the second part of the title, this is my country, what's yours? You're pretty much forced to now, you go figure out what's your atlas of Canada.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the, sometimes interesting to consider what falls away in the writing of a book, and I've done a lot of work around the idea of maps, and I've done a number of interviews with cartographers, and one of them, a geographer, a man called Alan Morantz, who wrote a book called Where is Here, using Northrop Frye's famous phrase, Canada's maps and the stories they tell. We were discussing the map of Canada, and he said to me, the map of Canada is our proper flag. And I thought that was a kind of beautiful way of putting the Canadian condition, in that we must every morning confront this absurd, wonderful nation. We don't have America's patriotic language. We hardly use the word patriot. It's in the Ontario version of the national anthem, but I grew up in Quebec where we sing the first half in French, so I didn't know that. We use this patriotic language, or we don't use this patriotic language, because at the same time we entertain our love of country. We're well aware of how tenuous the state is at all. We wonder whether it'll even exist 10 years from now. That's because of the situation in Quebec and with the Aboriginals and our weak central government and so on. So when Alan Morantz said the map of Canada is our proper flag, I think he was addressing this need we have every day to imagine the country again. And so one of the things I set out to do as I began the journey of this book was in a way to throw the map of Canada as it exists over the shoulder and say, forget about it. Let's start again. So I'm glad you said that, because it gave me enormous pleasure, for instance, to consider 3 great writers for, let's say, Alison MacLeod of Inverness, Nova Scotia, David Adams Richards of the Murray Machine, New Brunswick, Alice Munro of Goderich near Clinton, Ontario, and Guy Vanderhaeghe of Esterhazy, Saskatchewan. All writers who have been closely tied to particular places. In a way, this word has such negative connotations and shouldn't, considered in a kind of regional context despite their international reputations. And it gave me great pleasure to jettison all those provincial borders and think of them as rallied around a certain idea, the idea of work. Because in a way, you can look at that great story of Alison MacLeod's called The Closing Down of Summer, where his workers literally get up from the Nova Scotian beach at the end of summer, a long day in August, go to their cars, but they're going to their cars not just to drive home, but to drive to Ontario or to Saskatchewan, or to get on a plane to go to Peru or South Africa, to some company town. And then you can look at Homesick, a novel by Guy Vanderhaeghe, and you can read as they arrive into his small hard-done-by community on the prairie. So they're telling parts of the same story, and that was a kind of a way of looking at the country that gave me great pleasure. And at the end, I provide an epilogue in which I sort of basically say, you could attribute everything I've proposed to you as kind of related to something objective, to fact, or you could decide that it has everything to do with how I grew up, in which case you might say this, and I sort of offer my own analysis. But that's as a kind of cheeky incitement for other people to consider the way they regard the country. I hope that the best thing that could happen for me is that on the one hand, reading it, people gain a kind of an accumulated sense of just how special this happy accident of a country is. And the other is that people are inspired to argue by whatever means their idea of the place we're in. I think that it's very important for us to be able to participate and to pitch in.
The book is This Is My Country, What's Yours? A Literary Atlas of Canada. I've been speaking with the author Noah Richler, and This Is My Country, What's Yours? Published by McClelland and Stewart.